was described in the press as America's first female serial killer, a label that was both inaccurate and revealing. Inaccurate because women had killed before her, in numbers and with premeditation, for more than a century. Revealing because of what it showed about who the public expected to be capable of serial murder and who they did not. Her name was Aileen Carol Wuornos, born on a leap day in 1956 in Michigan, abandoned before she could walk, abused before she could read, pregnant before she turned 15, and living in the woods outside her grandfather's house at an age when most children were starting high school. Between November 1989 and November 1990, while working as a prostitute along the highways of Central Florida, she shot and killed 7 men. She was convicted of 6 of those murders and received 6 death sentences. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at the age of 46. She remains one of the most debated figures in the history of American criminal justice, not because her guilt was in doubt, but because the question of what her guilt meant and how it came to be has never produced a simple answer. This is the complete story of Aileen Wuornos, her childhood, the violence done to her, the violence she did in return, the system that failed her at every stage, and the execution that ended her life. If this is a story you want to follow, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps us keep making content like this. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Now settle in. Part 1. A Leap Day Child. February 29, 1956 to 1965. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, at a hospital in Rochester, Michigan, a suburb north of Detroit. She was born on a leap day, a date that recurs only once every 4 years, and this quirk of the calendar was one of the few distinctive things about her early life that could not be called a disaster. Her parents were teenagers. Her mother, Aileen Wuornos, was 16 years old at the time of Aileen's birth and had been 15 when she eloped with Leo Dale Pittman, a 19-year-old laborer and handyman. They married in 1955, the year Aileen's older brother Keith was born. Diane was 17 when she filed for divorce, a few months before Aileen was born, and the couple separated before Aileen entered the world. Leo Pittman was never part of his daughter's life. He was in and out of psychiatric facilities in Kansas and Michigan during the years of Aileen's childhood, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and in 1967 was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. On January 30, 1969, when Aileen was 12 years old, he hanged himself in his prison cell. She never met him. She was not informed of his death in any meaningful way. She learned about it later, the way she learned about most things in her childhood, without ceremony, without support, without anyone to help her understand what it meant. Aileen Wuornos did not raise her children. In January 1960, when Aileen was 3 years old and Keith was 4, Diane left. She abandoned them both with her parents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, Aileen's maternal grandparents, and did not return. Her reasons were never made fully clear. The responsibilities of single motherhood had defeated her. She was still a teenager herself. Whatever her reasoning, the effect was absolute. Her children were left in a house belonging to people they believed, for the next 9 years, to be their parents. Laurie and Britta Wuornos legally adopted Keith and Aileen on March 18, 1960. The children were told nothing about the adoption. They were told nothing about their biological mother, their biological father, or the circumstances of their abandonment. They grew up calling their grandparents Mom and Dad, believing this to be the truth, because no one told them otherwise. The house they grew up in was in Troy, Michigan, a working-class suburb where Laurie worked steadily and the family maintained the appearance of ordinary domestic life. What was inside the house was different. Laurie Wuornos was a heavy drinker with a violent temper. Britta Wuornos was also an alcoholic. Both grandparents were described by Aileen and by some childhood acquaintances as abusive, emotionally, physically, and in Laurie's case, sexually. Aileen later told investigators and courts that Laurie had beaten her regularly, forcing her to remove her clothing before striking her with a belt across the kitchen table. She said the abuse began before she was old enough to understand it fully and continued until she left the house permanently in her early teens. She also accused him of sexual abuse. These claims were never corroborated by physical evidence, and Laurie's son Barry, who testified at Aileen's sentencing hearing, said he had seen normal discipline but not systematic abuse. What was undisputed was that both grandparents drank heavily and that the household was unstable, chaotic, and frightening for children. When Aileen was approximately 6 years old, she and Keith were playing in the backyard with lighter fluid and matches. The fire got out of control. Aileen suffered burns to her face and hands. The scarring was permanent, visible on her face for the rest of her life. There was no definitive account of how the accident happened or who was supervising the children at the time. The burns became a physical feature that people noticed and mentioned when describing her throughout her childhood and adolescence. One more distinguishing mark on a child who was already becoming known in her neighborhood as different, as difficult, as someone to keep a distance from. Aileen was not a popular child. She had a violent temper from an early age. She was prone to explosive outbursts over minor provocations, and her classmates avoided her. Her IQ was tested as part of school assessments and measured 81, described by evaluators as falling in the low normal range, sufficient for ordinary functioning but indicative of some limitation in abstract processing. She began exhibiting hearing loss and vision problems during junior high school, compounding her difficulties in class. School officials noted behavioral concerns and recommended counseling. They administered mild tranquilizers on an experimental basis in an attempt to reduce the frequency of her outbursts. Neither intervention produced lasting change. The problems were structural, rooted in the house she went home to every afternoon, and no amount of intervention at the level of the child could address the conditions she was living in. When Aileen was approximately 11 or 12 years old, she and Keith discovered the truth about their parentage. The specific mechanism by which the secret emerged varied in different accounts. Some said a relative told them, others said they found documents. Others said their grandmother's deteriorating health and increasing alcoholism led to a breakdown of the family's capacity to maintain the fiction. However it happened, the discovery was devastating. They had been living with a lie for their entire conscious lives. The people they believed to be their parents were their grandparents. Their actual mother had abandoned them as toddlers. Their actual father was in a prison for attacking a child and would kill himself before they could form any understanding of who he was. The revelation did not provide clarity. It provided additional chaos, layered on top of everything that was already wrong in that house in Troy. By this point, Aileen had been engaging in sexual activity for money and goods since approximately age 11. Cigarettes, food, drugs, or whatever the boys at school were willing to provide in exchange. This is documented across multiple independent sources and corroborated by people who knew her at the time. Whether this behavior was solely a product of her home environment, or whether she was also being abused by adults outside the family at this age, remained a subject of competing accounts throughout her life. What was certain was that a child who had been physically beaten in the kitchen of her family home, raised by alcoholics who withheld the truth of her own identity from her, and left without any framework for understanding her own value or safety, had arrived at adolescence with no tools for self-protection, and no adults she could trust. Part 2. The Woods, the Roads, and the Wreckage, 1970 to 1976. In 1970, when Aileen was 14 years old, she became pregnant. The circumstances were never fully established in a legal sense. She told different accounts at different times that a friend of her grandfather's had raped her, that Keith might be the father, that it was a neighborhood boy. What all accounts agreed on was that she did not choose the pregnancy, and that when it became known in the household, no one believed her account of how it had happened. No police report was ever filed. She was sent to a home for unwed mothers in the Detroit area, where she gave birth to a son on March 23, 1971. She was 15 years old. She was not allowed to hold the baby before he was placed for adoption. She asked to hold him and was refused. She never saw him again. A few months after giving birth, Aileen dropped out of school. That same summer, Britta Wuornos died. The official cause of death was liver failure, a direct consequence of her long-term alcoholism. Diane Wuornos, Aileen's biological mother, later told people she believed Lori had killed Britta. This claim was never investigated or substantiated. What followed Britta's death was swift and definitive. Lori told both Aileen and Keith they needed to leave his house. He told them they were no longer welcome. Family members later said he threatened to kill them if they were not removed. Keith and Aileen were briefly made wards of the court. Then Aileen, who was 15 years old and had nowhere to go and no one who was going to come for her, ran away. She went to the woods near the old house and lived there. This is worth pausing on. She was 15 years old. She had given birth and had the child taken from her. Her grandmother was dead. Her grandfather had thrown her out. Her brother was similarly displaced. She went to the woods and lived there because there was nowhere else. She supported herself through prostitution. She had no other means of income and no one who was offering her another option. The pattern that would define the next 20 years of her life. Movement, sex work, alcohol, escalating arrests, escalating instability, was formed in these months in the Michigan woods when she was still a teenager. Her arrest record began in earnest in her late teens. On May 27, 1974, at age 18, she was arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado, for driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, and firing a .22 caliber pistol from a moving vehicle. She failed to appear in court and was charged with that as well. These were the opening entries in a rap sheet that would eventually include illegal possession of a firearm, forgery, armed robbery, assault, and obstruction of justice. Her arrest records consistently noted in the remarks fields written by officers who processed her. Attitude poor. In 1976, she hitchhiked to Florida, where she met Louis Gratz Fell, a 69-year-old president of a yacht club from a wealthy Florida community. Fell was charmed by Aileen. He was 4 decades older than she was, and whatever he was seeking in her company, he sought it with enough conviction to propose marriage. The announcement of their engagement and subsequent wedding was printed in the society pages of a local Florida newspaper, a surreal marker in a life that contained almost nothing else that could be described as a society page event. They married in 1976. Aileen was 20, Louis was 69. The marriage lasted 9 weeks. Wuornos repeatedly sought out confrontations at local bars during those 9 weeks, was arrested for assault, and struck Louis with his own cane during one argument. He obtained a restraining order against her and had the marriage annulled on July 21, 1976. Aileen was back to nothing. On July 14, 2 weeks before the annulment was finalized, she had been arrested at a bar in Antrim County, Michigan, for throwing a cue ball at a bartender's head during an argument. 3 days later, on July 17, 1976, her brother Keith died of esophageal cancer. He was 21 years old. She received $10,000 from his life insurance policy. She bought a new car with part of the money, drove it into something, wrecked it, and spent the rest on alcohol and goods within 2 months. There was nothing left. There had only been Keith in the full roster of people who had ever been consistently in her life. And now Keith was gone too. She drifted through the rest of the 1970s and the early 1980s in a pattern that was, by this point, deeply established, hitchhiking across Florida and adjacent states working as a prostitute, getting arrested for minor and occasionally serious offenses, drinking heavily. In 1978, between the ages of 21 and 22, she attempted suicide multiple times. Across the span from age 14 to 22, she attempted to kill herself 6 times. The methods varied: a gunshot wound to the abdomen in one attempt, a drug overdose in another. She survived each time. She received, by her own account and the accounts of people who interacted with her in this period, very little in the way of mental health support following any of these attempts. She would be discharged and within days find herself back in the same conditions that had produced the attempt. On May 20th, 1981, she was arrested in Edgewater, Florida, for the armed robbery of a convenience store. She had taken $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes. She was convicted in May 1982 and released in June 1983. She was arrested in 1984 for attempting to pass forged checks at a bank in Key West. She was suspected in the theft of a revolver and ammunition in Pasco County in November 1985. In January 1986, she was arrested in Miami for car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. Found in a stolen car with a .38 caliber revolver and a box of ammunition, providing a fake ID bearing her aunt's name. Wuornos used aliases routinely and had acquired a collection of them: Lee Blahovec, Lori Grody, Cami Marsh Green. Each name was a small piece of armor in a life built around surviving by any means available. Then, in June 1986, she walked into a gay bar in Daytona Beach called the Zodiac and met Tyria Moore. Part 3, Tyria Moore and the Years Before the Murders, 1986 to 1989. Tyria Jo Moore was 24 years old when she met Aileen Wuornos at the Zodiac Bar in Daytona Beach in the summer of 1986. She was working as a motel maid, earning low wages, and was 6 years younger than Aileen. By every account of the relationship from people who observed it, the attraction was immediate and powerful. Aileen described it at her trial in terms that stripped away any pretense of calculation or composure. It was love beyond imaginable, she said. Earthly words cannot describe how I felt about Tyria. Before her execution, she told reporters she still considered herself in love with Moore, despite everything that had happened between them. Whatever Moore felt was harder to determine. She remained opaque throughout the investigation, the trial, and the years that followed, declining most interviews and never fully characterizing the nature or depth of her feelings for Aileen. What was clear was that the relationship was the most stable thing Aileen Wuornos had ever had. Moore moved in with her. Aileen continued working as a prostitute to support them both, a dynamic that was a source of both stability and tension in the relationship. Moore was aware of how Aileen earned money. She was present in the network of cheap motels, rooming houses, and temporary lodgings that constituted their shared domestic life. She did not participate in Aileen's sex work, but she benefited from its proceeds. They fought. They had periods of separation. They moved frequently, staying in a succession of motel rooms across Florida. They were sometimes drunk, sometimes broke, sometimes in the company of other women from the bar circuit they moved through. They were, by every available account, genuinely bonded. The arrests continued. On July 4, 1987, Daytona Beach police detained both Wuornos and Moore following an incident in a bar in which they were accused of assault and battery with a beer bottle. On March 12, 1988, Wuornos accused a Daytona Beach bus driver of assault, claiming he pushed her off the bus. Moore was listed as a witness to the incident. In June 1986, Volusia County deputies had already detained Wuornos for questioning after a male companion accused her of pulling a gun in his car and demanding $200. When police searched the car in that incident, they found a .22 caliber pistol under the passenger seat she had occupied and a supply of spare ammunition. She was not arrested on that occasion. The gun was noted, filed, and forgotten. By this point in her life, Wuornos had been carrying loaded firearms for most of her adult years. She kept a .22 caliber pistol in her bag as a matter of routine. Practical self-defense, she would have said, for a woman whose work placed her alone in cars with strangers on the dark highways of Central Florida. The assessment was not unreasonable. Prostitutes working the Florida interstates were vulnerable in ways that the criminal justice system had never particularly exerted itself to address. They were frequently assaulted, raped, and killed by the men who hired them, and the reporting of these crimes was structurally discouraged. Police who were called to investigate assaults on prostitutes were working within a system that treated the women as criminals first and victims never. Aileen Wuornos knew this better than most. She had been working these highways for nearly 2 decades. She'd been handling the consequences of violence at the hands of men since she was a child in her grandfather's house. In the summer and fall of 1989, Wuornos and Moore's relationship had reached one of its periodic breaking points. They were living apart for stretches. Aileen was working alone, picking up clients along the highways in the way she had done for years, hitchhiking with her thumb out or positioning herself at rest stops or truck stops, making a deal, getting in a car, finding a location, conducting her business, and taking the cash. She was carrying her .22. She had always carried her .22. On November 30th, 1989, she picked up a man named Richard Mallory. Part 4, The 7 Men, November 1989 to November 1990. Richard Mallory was 51 years old, from Clearwater, Florida. He owned an electronics repair shop, a TV repair business in Palm Harbor, and by multiple accounts, he lived a life organized significantly around alcohol, sex, and obsessive sexual behavior. On the evening of November 30th, 1989, he locked up his shop and drove his 1977 Cadillac toward Volusia County. He picked up Wuornos somewhere along the way. What happened next was disputed from the first moment of the investigation and remained disputed through every phase of the legal proceedings. Wuornos's account, given in her confession and repeated at trial, was that Mallory became violent. She said he raped and sodomized her, that he tied her to the steering wheel of the car, that he choked her with a cord and forced rubbing alcohol from a Vicine bottle into her body. She said she fought free, grabbed her bag, and when he came at her again, shot him. She described shooting him once while he was still behind the wheel, then again when he crawled out of the car, then twice more after he fell to the ground. She described going through his pockets, covering his body with a piece of carpet, and driving away in his car. His body was found on December 13th, 1989, in a wooded area off Interstate 95 in Volusia County, naked, wrapped in carpet, shot 3 times in the chest. 2 bullets in the left lung were found to be the cause of death. His abandoned car had been found 2 days after the murder, left on Ormond Beach. What was not presented to any jury at Aileen Wuornos's trial, and was not discovered by investigators until November 1992, when a Dateline NBC reporter named Michelle Gillen found the records, was that Richard Mallory had a serious criminal history involving sexual violence. In 1957, he had broken into a Maryland woman's home and attempted to assault her. He had pleaded insanity. He had served approximately 10 years in a prison psychiatric institution for sexual offenders. The institution's records described him as possessing strong sociopathic traits. Detectives who had investigated Mallory after his death and who later claimed to have found no evidence corroborating Wuornos's account of his violence had access to federal criminal records. They did not check them before the trial. The information was available. It was not sought. The jury who convicted Aileen Wuornos of first-degree murder in January 1992 made their decision without ever knowing that the man she said had raped her had previously served a decade in prison for attempted rape. Whether Mallory raped Wuornos on November 30th, 1989 cannot be proven from the available evidence. What can be said with certainty is that his documented history made the claim credible in ways that were deliberately obscured from the people tasked with weighing it. The second victim was David Andrew Spears, 47 years old, a construction worker from Winter Garden, Florida. He was reported missing on May 19, 1990. His naked body was found on June 1, 1990, along U.S. Highway 19 in Citrus County. He had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol. The third victim was Charles Edmund Cascadon, 40 years old, a part-time rodeo worker from Missouri who had roots in Florida. He was killed on approximately May 34, 1990. His naked body was found on June 6, 1990 in Pasco County. He had been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Wuornos later said she killed him after suspecting he was involved in drug smuggling, an explanation that was characteristically unstable and contradicted other versions of events she gave at different times. The fourth victim was Peter Abraham Seams, 65 years old, a retired merchant seaman from Jupiter, Florida, who had become a born-again Christian in later life and engaged in missionary work. On July 4, 1990, he disappeared while driving from Jupiter to Arkansas to visit relatives. His body was never found. What was found, some weeks after his disappearance, was his car, crashed and abandoned on a road in Orange Springs, Volusia County, by 2 women who had been seen by witnesses fleeing the scene. One of the witnesses was close enough to see the women clearly. Composite sketches were produced. A palm print on the door of the crashed car was taken into evidence. The sketches were distributed statewide through media outlets across Florida. The coverage produced significant public attention and was the first moment at which the possibility of a female serial killer operating along Florida's highways was explicitly raised in public. Seams is the only victim for whom no body was ever found, and because no body was recovered, Wuornos was never formally charged with his murder, despite having confessed to it. The circumstances of his death remain, technically, unresolved in a legal sense. The fifth victim was Troy Eugene Burress, 50 years old, a sausage delivery driver from Ocala. He was reported missing on July 30, 1990. His body was found on August 4, 1990, in a wooded area near State Road 19 in Marion County. He had been shot twice with a .22 caliber firearm. The sixth victim was Dick Humphreys, 56 years old, a retired police chief from Sebring who had moved to Florida and was working as a child abuse investigator for the Florida Health and Rehabilitative Services at the time of his death. He was reported missing on September 11, 1990. His body was found the same day near Interstate 75 in Marion County. He had been shot 7 times with a .22 caliber firearm. The seventh victim was Walter Gino Antonio, 61 years old, a truck driver from Merritt Island who was also a Brevard County Reserve Deputy Sheriff. He was found on November 19, 1990, along a remote road in Dixie County, wearing only his socks. He had been shot 4 times, 3 in the back and once in the head. A paper dinner napkin was found near his body and his dentures were missing. He was engaged to be married when he died. 7 men across 12 months, all shot with a .22 caliber pistol, most found naked, most in wooded areas near Central Florida highways. After each killing, Wuornos took the victims' valuables, wallets, cameras, tools, jewelry, and pawned them at shops across Florida using her string of aliases. She was required by Florida law to provide a thumbprint at each transaction. Her thumbprint was in every pawnshop database. She was building an evidence trail with every transaction she made, and she did not know it, or did not care, or could not stop. Part 5. The Investigation and the Trap, mid-1990 to January 1991. The Florida investigation into the highway killings had been proceeding on multiple tracks since the discovery of Richard Mallory's body in December 1989. Individual county sheriff's offices, Volusia, Citrus, Pasco, Marion, Dixie, had each opened cases when bodies appeared in their jurisdictions. The fragmented nature of Florida law enforcement, organized by county rather than centrally coordinated, meant that the connections between the deaths were slow to be formally recognized. Each county saw its case as its own. Each detective ran its own investigation. It was not until mid-1990, when the bodies were accumulating fast enough that the pattern became undeniable, that investigators from multiple jurisdictions began comparing notes. By late 1990, investigators had a solid working picture of what they were looking for. The victims were middle-aged white men. They had all been shot with the same caliber weapon. Most had been found naked. All had been robbed. The killer was almost certainly a woman, a female prostitute working the Florida interstates and U.S. highways, picking up clients in their own cars, killing them, taking their belongings, and disappearing. The composite sketches from the Seams car crash had been distributed widely. A second woman had been seen with the first at the crash site. The investigation was looking for two women. The breakthrough came from the pawn shop records. Pawn shops in Florida were required by law to collect fingerprints from sellers. Investigators identified a camera belonging to Richard Mallory that had been pawned under the name Cammie Marsh Green. They identified tools belonging to David Spears that had been pawned under the same name. Analysis of the fingerprints tied Cammie Marsh Green to the name Lori Grody, another alias, and from Lori Grody, through fingerprint comparison with the criminal records database, to the real identity Aileen Wuornos, whose arrest record stretched back to 1974, and whose most recent address was a series of motels in the Daytona Beach area. A second name emerged from witness accounts of the women who had crashed Seams's car. Investigators identified the companion as Tyria Moore, a motel maid with a Daytona Beach history who was known to be Wuornos's long-term companion. By December 1990, the investigation had both names. Tracking Moore's movements led them to Florida, and Wuornos was known to frequent a biker bar called The Last Resort in Volusia County, a dive bar in Port Orange, where she drank regularly and was known to the regulars. Investigators placed the bar under surveillance. On January 9, 1991, Wuornos was outside The Last Resort. She had been lured outside by bar patrons who had been enlisted, wittingly or not, by undercover officers. She was arrested on the basis of an outstanding warrant for carrying a concealed weapon, issued in the name Lori Grody. She told the officers loudly and immediately, "I want to know what the hell is going on here." She was taken into custody. She did not know at the moment of her arrest exactly how much investigators already knew. Police located Tyria Moore the following day in Pittston, Pennsylvania, where she had gone to stay with family. Moore was confronted with the evidence investigators had accumulated. She was told she was potentially facing charges in connection with the murders. She was offered a deal, full immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation, including her willingness to contact Wuornos and attempt to elicit a confession. Moore accepted the deal. Investigators brought her back to Florida and installed her in a motel room equipped with recording equipment. They guided her through a series of telephone calls to Wuornos at the jail. The recordings of those calls are among the most painful documents in the case. Wuornos, sitting in a jail cell, does not know that Moore has agreed to help build the case against her. She hears only her partner, the person she had described in court as the great love of her life, telling her that she is scared, that the police are asking questions about her, that she needs help, that she doesn't know what to do. Wuornos, whose entire history was a story of loving people who left her and desperately trying to prevent that departure, made a calculation that she had apparently been making her whole life. She would absorb whatever she needed to absorb to keep the person she loved from being hurt. She told Moore, "If I have to confess to everything just to keep you out of trouble, I will." Moore said, "Do it now. Get it over with." 3 days after her arrest, on January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos confessed to all 7 murders. She claimed in her initial confessions that all 7 men had either raped or attempted to rape her. This was her explanation and her defense, and she maintained some version of it through multiple recantations, reversals, and restatements over the following decade. At various times she claimed all were self-defense, then that only some were, then that none were. The inconsistency in her accounts was used by prosecutors as evidence of dishonesty and by her defenders as evidence of severe psychological damage. It was probably both. The truth of what happened in each of those cars, on each of those nights, across those 12 months of Florida highway, was known with certainty only to Wuornos. Part 6, The Trial of Richard Mallory, January 1992. After her arrest and confession, Wuornos went through a period of legal proceedings that lasted the better part of a year before her first trial. She was indigent and entitled to public defense, but she was also by this point becoming a figure of significant commercial interest. Hollywood production companies had begun making inquiries. True crime publishers were circling. The detective investigators on the case, 3 Volusia County officers whose work had produced the arrest, were apparently among those exploring the commercial potential of their involvement. After the trial, it was revealed that all 3 detectives had negotiated deals to sell their story and subsequently resigned from the department. Tyria Moore had also entered into book and movie deals related to her experiences. There was, from the earliest days of the case, a financial current running alongside the criminal proceedings, pulling at the people connected to the case in ways that would distort the proceedings around Aileen Wuornos in ways she would spend years trying to articulate, and that no one in any position of authority was particularly interested in acknowledging. Into this environment came Arlene Prahl, a 44-year-old born-again Christian who raised horses and wolves on a farm in central Florida with her husband. In November 1991, she legally adopted Aileen Wuornos, a woman 6 years younger than herself who was sitting on death row for murders she had not yet been tried for. She claimed the adoption was motivated by a divine instruction she had received in a dream. She had, she said, watched Wuornos's face on the television news and read something in her eyes that convinced her to act. The adoption was formal and legal. It was processed through the Florida courts. It made Prale Wuornos's legal next of kin, and therefore the person through whom media and publishing entities would need to negotiate access, which was, documentarian Nick Broomfield eventually concluded after extensive investigation, the point. Prahl introduced Wuornos to Stephen Glazer, a bearded, ponytailed, self-styled maverick attorney who advertised on local television under the slogan Dr. Legal and described himself in those ads as a champion of the powerless. He smoked marijuana before court appearances. He had no office. He had no significant criminal defense experience. Wuornos hired him after seeing his television commercial from her prison cell, and he took over her representation for all proceedings following the first trial. Broomfield's 1992 documentary about Wuornos, which he titled Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, was primarily concerned with documenting the relationship between Prale, Glazer, and the commercial interests that appeared to be driving their decisions around their client's legal strategy. He paid them $10,000 for an interview with Wuornos. He later described the experience as entering a world in which serial killers had agents. The trial for the murder of Richard Mallory opened on January 13, 1992, before Judge Uriel Blount in Volusia County. Blount had come out of retirement specifically to try the case. The prosecution was led by State's Attorney John Tanner. Wuornos was represented by Tricia Jenkins, Chief Assistant Public Defender of the 5th Judicial Circuit. It was the only murder trial Wuornos would have. All subsequent charges were resolved through guilty pleas or no contest pleas. The prosecution's central evidence was the videotaped confession Wuornos had given in January 1991, in which she described the shooting of Mallory in sequential detail. They also presented pawnshop records linking her to Mallory's property, the thumbprints collected under the alias Cammie Marsh Green, the palm print from Simp's abandoned car, and physical evidence from the crime scene. Under Florida's Williams rule, which permits the introduction of evidence from other cases to demonstrate a pattern of criminal behavior, the prosecution was allowed to present evidence from all 6 other murders to the jury, an extraordinary expansion of the evidentiary scope of a single trial. The jury was therefore assessing not just whether Aileen Wuornos had killed Richard Mallory in self-defense, but whether her conduct across 12 months of serial killing suggested a pattern of premeditated robbery and murder rather than reactive self-defense. The deck was, by design and by law, stacked. Against her attorney's explicit advice, Wuornos chose to testify on her own behalf. She was the only defense witness. She described Mallory's attack in vivid detail: the rape, the assault, the cord around her neck, the rubbing alcohol, and maintained throughout direct examination that she had acted in self-defense. Then cross-examination began. The prosecutor questioned her relentlessly about the inconsistencies in her various accounts of what had happened. She became agitated. She became angry. She invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 25 times during cross-examination. Her attorneys, seated at the defense table, urged her repeatedly not to answer. She answered anyway. Her answers were not always consistent with her previous testimony. She was, by every observer's account, losing the jury with each passing minute. What the jury did not know, what no one at the trial was permitted to tell them, was that Richard Mallory had a 1957 conviction for assault with intent to rape and had served approximately a decade in a Maryland prison psychiatric institution for sexual offenders. Wuornos's trial attorney, Tricia Jenkins, was criticized extensively in the aftermath of the verdict for failing to discover and present this information. The records existed in federal criminal databases. Jenkins did not search for them. The detectives who had investigated Mallory had not searched for them. The information that might have given Aileen Wuornos's self-defense claim its most concrete factual support was sitting in a file somewhere that no one involved in her defense had thought to open. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing, the state's expert psychologist testified that Wuornos suffered from both borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Defense psychologists agreed that she was severely psychologically damaged and argued that these conditions constituted mitigating factors. Judge Blount sentenced Wuornos to death. As she was led out of the courtroom, she turned to the prosecutor and the judge and told them, "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie." On March 31st, 1992, Wuornos stood before a court in Marion County and pleaded no contest to 3 murders, those of Dick Humphreys, Troy Burris, and David Spears. She told the court she wanted to get right with God. She received 3 additional death sentences. Arlene Prahl and Stephen Glazer had encouraged this course. Their reasoning, as described to Nick Broomfield during filming and subsequently to others, was that confessing and accepting the sentences would speed Wuornos toward divine forgiveness. After the sentencing, as she was taken from the courtroom, Wuornos told the judge she would be in heaven while he was rotting in hell. She meant it sincerely in the theological sense. She believed, or wanted to believe, that she was making her peace with God, and that this would matter on whatever came after. In June 1992, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Carskadon and received her 5th death sentence. In February 1993, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Antonio, the last of the 6 confirmed convictions, and received her 6th. During the court statement accompanying this final plea, she held to her original position regarding the first murder. "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me, as I've told you," she said, "but these others did not. They only began to start to." This statement was parsed extensively in the aftermath. What did it mean that she was partially retracting the self-defense claim while maintaining it for the first case? Was it an honest account? Was it strategic? Was it the result of psychological deterioration? Different observers reached different conclusions. The courts reached one conclusion. She had pleaded guilty and received her sentences, and the legal process was complete. No charges were ever brought in connection with the death of Peter Seams. His body was never found. Without a body, there could be no murder charge under Florida law at the time. He appeared in discussions of the case, in the pawn shop records, in the palm print evidence and the composite sketches, in Wuornos' own confession, but never in any formal legal proceeding. His family waited for a body that never came. By the end of 1993, Aileen Wuornos held 6 death sentences. She was in her late 30s. She was housed at Florida's Broward Correctional Institution, then later at Florida's Correctional Institution for Women at Lowell. She had been severed from Prale and Glazer, whose relationship with her had by that point collapsed entirely under the weight of her suspicions about their motives. She had virtually no one. She listened in her cell on death row to an album called Tiger Lily by Natalie Merchant. She played the song Carnival repeatedly for hours, for days, in the manner of someone finding something that spoke to a version of themselves they could not otherwise access. Part 8. Death Row and the Long Decline. 1993 to 2001. Aileen Wuornos spent more than 10 years on Florida's death row. The decade between her convictions and her execution was characterized by a progressive deterioration of her mental and psychological state that was documented by multiple independent observers, and that ultimately raised one of the central legal and ethical questions of her case: whether the state of Florida was executing a person who was, in any meaningful sense, capable of understanding what was happening to her and why. The appeals process moved through its stages. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed her conviction and death sentence in November 1994. She filed a petition for certiorari review in the United States Supreme Court. The petition was denied in April 1995. She pursued post-conviction motions through the state courts. She filed federal habeas corpus petitions. Through all of it, she was represented by a succession of court-appointed attorneys, some more engaged than others, all working within the constraints of a system that had already decided, at multiple levels, that her sentences should stand. In November 1992, the Dateline NBC investigation that located Mallory's prior conviction for sexual assault became public. This was the information that Wuornos had been claiming existed since her first day in custody, that the man she said had raped her was a man with a documented history of raping women. The revelation created a brief public controversy about the fairness of her trial. It did not alter her legal situation. Courts reviewing her post-conviction appeals considered and rejected arguments that the failure to discover and present Mallory's criminal history had constituted ineffective assistance of counsel, or that it would have produced a different verdict. The argument about what the jury would have decided if they had known was precisely the kind of argument that post-conviction courts were least equipped to adjudicate. During her years on death row, Wuornos became increasingly paranoid, increasingly volatile, and increasingly disconnected from the stable frameworks of reality that most people use to navigate their daily lives. She made accusations, that prison officials were abusing her, that she was being subjected to forms of torture, that authorities were using sonic pressure technology to control or alter her mental state. These claims were reported by documentarians and journalists who interviewed her and were assessed by psychiatric professionals as indicative of psychotic or delusional thinking. They were also, for Wuornos, clearly real. The world she described was the world she was living in, as far as she could determine. Nick Broomfield returned to document her again in 2002, making what became the film Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. He was served with a subpoena to appear at Wuornos's final appeals hearing in Marion County. She had apparently decided to waive her remaining appeals and was seeking to accelerate her execution, and Broomfield's presence as a filmmaker who had documented aspects of her case made him legally relevant to the proceedings. The hearing was presided over by Judge Victor Musla. The Office of Capital Collateral Regional Counsel, led by attorney Joseph Hobson, was fighting to keep her alive, arguing that Wuornos's mental state made her incompetent to waive her appeals, and that executing her in her current psychological condition would be unconstitutional. Wuornos, from the witness stand, expressed herself in terms that made the argument difficult to advance. She was articulate about her desire to die, clear about her exhaustion, and specific about her belief that she had been tortured in prison and that the outside world was malevolent and corrupt, and that she wanted nothing more to do with it. On June 6, 2001, Wuornos had written directly to the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court, requesting a hearing to waive her appeals. She said she was tired of prison. She said the abuse she was experiencing at the hands of prison officials was intolerable. She said she wanted to die. The state of Florida's position was that she had the right to make this request, and that it should be honored. The death warrant was signed by Governor Jeb Bush on September 5, 2002. Her attorney filed a motion to declare her incompetent to be executed. Psychiatric examiners appointed by the governor found her competent. Her attorney filed a motion to dissolve the temporary stay that had been granted pending these evaluations. The Florida Supreme Court dissolved the stay on October 2, 2002. The day before her execution, Broomfield secured a final interview. She was in a cell at the Florida State Prison in Starka, transferred there for the execution. She told Broomfield she had been tortured. She said the prison had used sonic pressure against her. She raged against a society she said had railroaded her. She told him, "You sabotaged my ass, society." Then she ended the interview. Part 9, The Execution, October 9, 2002. Florida's execution protocol required that condemned prisoners be moved to the Florida State Prison at Stark in Bradford County in the days before the scheduled execution. The prison housed the state's execution chamber. Aileen Wuornos arrived there in early October 2002, transferred from the women's facility at Lowell, where she had spent most of her sentence. She was 46 years old. Her final meal was Kentucky Fried Chicken and French fries. The choice was noted by reporters who knew her history with the chain. She had eaten at KFC locations across Florida during the 12 months of the murders, a mundane detail that lodged itself in the documentation of the case. She ate it. She received a visit from a minister. She was not visited by Arlene Prohl, whose relationship with her had been severed years earlier. She was not visited by Tyria Moore, who had testified against her at trial, and who had long since returned to Pennsylvania, and a private life that she maintained with considerable determination to remain out of the public record. On the morning of October 9, 2002, at 9:47 in the morning, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. The procedure was administered in the execution chamber with witnesses present in an observation area behind glass. A small number of approved observers, including journalists and, in some states, relatives of victims. She was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. She was the second woman to be executed in Florida since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. She was the 10th woman to be executed in the United States since that reinstatement. After the execution, a prison spokesman read her final prepared statement at a press conference. The statement was, "I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." It was the same declaration she had made when she was sentenced, years earlier, when she told the judge she would be back like Independence Day. Whatever framework she had constructed in the final years of her life, the blend of Christian belief, paranoid cosmology, and apocalyptic imagery, it was fully intact at the moment of her death. Her body was claimed by Dawn Botkins, a childhood friend from Michigan who had maintained contact with Wuornos during her years on death row, and who was among the very small number of people who had remained consistently present in her life without apparent commercial motivation. Wuornos was cremated, as she had requested, with her Bible. Botkins carried her ashes to Michigan and scattered them beneath a tree. At Wuornos's specific request, Natalie Merchant's song Carnival was played at her funeral. When Merchant later learned that Wuornos had spent hours listening to her album on death row and had requested the song for her funeral, she gave permission for it to appear in the closing credits of Broomfield's 2003 documentary. Merchant said in a statement that she found the subject matter almost too disturbing to watch, that Wuornos had lived a life beyond her worst nightmares, and that learning Wuornos had found comfort in her music was the only thing that made her feel she could participate in the telling of the story. Part 10. What Remains. The 7 victims of Aileen Wuornos were real people with lives that existed before and entirely independent of her. The weight of the case, the debates about self-defense and misogyny and institutional failure and the death penalty, tends to flatten them into a collective, an abstraction of middle-aged white male motorists, when what they were was individual. Richard Mallory was 51 years old, an electronics repairman from Clearwater, a man whose history of sexual violence and institutionalization for sexual offenses was known to law enforcement and concealed from the jury that decided Aileen Wuornos's fate. The failure to disclose his criminal history was not simply a legal deficiency in her trial. It was an institutional choice, conscious or unconscious, to treat her account of being raped as inherently unworthy of the investigative effort required to verify it. David Spears was 47, a construction worker. He left for work one morning and did not come back. Charles Carskaddon was 40, a rodeo worker who had been moving through Florida in the late spring of 1990. Peter Seams was 65, a retired merchant seaman turned lay missionary who was driving to Arkansas to see family and whose body was never found, leaving his family without the closure that a burial provides and the legal system without the evidence required to formally charge his killer. Troy Burris was 50, a delivery driver making rounds through Central Florida. Dick Humphreys was 56, a retired police chief who had gone into child welfare work, spending his professional life trying to protect children from the kind of abuse that had shaped Aileen Wuornos's childhood, killed by the person that childhood had produced. Walter Antonio was 61, a reserve sheriff's deputy and truck driver who was engaged to be married when he died. The question of whether any of them deserved what happened to them is separate from the question of whether they were killed in self-defense, and both questions are separate from the question of what produced Aileen Wuornos. A child left in the woods at 15 because no adult would take her in. A girl whose pregnancy by rape was blamed on her by the family that had already been beating her. A woman who worked the highways of Florida for 20 years with a loaded gun in her bag because she had no one and nothing else, and because the gun was the only protection she had ever had that reliably stayed when she needed it. The debates that her case generated have not been resolved. Whether she was primarily a serial killer or primarily a survivor acting out of accumulated trauma and whether those categories are mutually exclusive has been argued in academic literature, feminist theory, legal scholarship, and popular culture for more than 30 years. The 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her portrayal of Wuornos, presented her as a fundamentally sympathetic figure whose crimes were the direct consequence of a lifetime of abuse and exploitation. Nick Broomfield's two documentaries raised persistent questions about the systemic corruption that surrounded her prosecution and execution. Her defenders pointed to Mallory's hidden criminal history, to the perjured testimony, to the detectives who sold their stories, to the lawyer who came to court stoned, to the adopted mother who used her as a commercial asset, to the phone calls in which her lover was weaponized against her by the state. Her critics pointed to the 7 dead men. Both were pointing at real things. The case of Aileen Wuornos was not simple, not clean, and not over in any meaningful sense when the lethal injection was administered on the morning of October 9, 2002. It remains one of those cases in which the machinery of American justice processed a human being and produced an outcome that satisfied almost no one. Not the people who wanted accountability for the 7 deaths, not the people who wanted accountability for the life that produced them, and not the woman herself, who told the world in her final statement that she was sailing with the rock and would be back. She was cremated with her Bible. Her ashes were scattered under a tree in Michigan. She had been born in Michigan on a leap day in 1956 and had spent the intervening 46 years in a relationship with a world that had never, not once, made her feel that she belonged in it. At the end, she left it on her own terms, not because Florida gave her no choice, but because she stopped fighting for more time. She said she was going with Jesus. She said she would be back. She was 46 years old and she had been alone for almost all of them. Thank you for staying with us through the complete story of Aileen Wuornos. Please remember the 7 victims by name. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us keep making content like this. And we'll see you in the next one.